Okay, thanks Peter, thanks Dr. Gleason. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Mark Henrie. I guess the reason that I'm here is that my graduate education is in political theory, political philosophy at Harvard, and I've thought a lot about church-state relations. I'm on the editorial advisory board of a journal called First Things that is a journal dedicated to religion and public life. And so I think a lot about these kinds of matters, and thought that the way that I could contribute to our discussion tonight is to try to provide some background reflections that if I make it, if I can squish down enough, it'll get beyond that, but it may end up only being the background stuff. And I think that in light of the current so-called crisis, a lot of people say, what is this crisis? Isn't there just, don't we believe in the separation of church and state? Isn't that the American way? Aren't you Catholics somehow trying to interject your particular views into public policy in an illegitimate way? I think a lot of people who don't pay attention to what's really going on think in those terms. There's some Catholic thing where the Catholics are trying to take away contraception or something like this, not recognizing that the actual situation is that the Catholics simply want to go back to the way things were about 3 months ago, which was not a time when Catholic particular teachings were dominating American policy. And in fact, what's happening is a change is occurring that will not simply allow there to be contraception, but force everyone to pay for it. In any event, this church-state separationist language is in the air, and I think that one of the interesting things about Archbishop Chaffee's book, Render Unto Caesar, is he points out very forcefully that the separation of church and state is a Christian political achievement about which we should be proud. And I think that a lot of us don't think that that's the case, but in fact it is. This is true. The separation of church and state is something that was achieved by Christian political action. For one thing, in order to separate church and state, there has to be a church. You couldn't really do it without a church. And so there must be something called a church. But this is true, this separation into two spheres, which we hear about in Augustine's City of God book, which distinguishes the city of God from the city of man, the heavenly city from the earthly city. Hence Father Gleason's invocation of St. Augustine tonight. In theory, this separation is founded on Christ's very words, "My kingdom is not of this world." There is certainly a dominion of the Lord, but it does not take the form of political rule on earth. And this is quite different from the project of Muhammad, for example, who sought precisely to bring Allah's kingdom to earth, to have the direct rule of God on earth. That's what the Muslim project is. But that's not what we think the church is about. The church is the domain of grace, of charity, and of forgiveness. The domain of politics is the domain of nature, of justice, and of punishment. And these are distinct realms which, while they overlap, something like a separation into two spheres seems like a necessity. It's a necessary implication of the gospel at the level of theory. In practice also, we recall that for the first 3 centuries after Christ's death and resurrection, the church was a persecuted sect, living at the social margins of a hostile Roman Empire. Christian priests and bishops counseled the faithful to avoid public service and to live a life in retirement, insulated from the struggles of political power. Until the end of time, a memory of this original situation for the church will remain a feature of Christian consciousness and Christian doctrine. The church is emphatically not a state. It is entirely natural for the church to be powerless before Caesar. This is a perfectly possible outcome which we have had before for 300 years, and which we may have again any time. Now keep in mind, however, that while the church was marginalized and relatively powerless in the time of the Caesars, the church did pray for Caesar, but the church adamantly refused to burn incense to Caesar. So that even when the church was a tiny sect, it knew that it must stand for God's truth against any threat of coercion, even coercion unto martyrdom. And so the church has this interesting kind of duality. It can recognize itself as the church, even in a condition of relative political powerlessness, but nevertheless, emphatically it claims to have the truth which is true for all people, and publicly, therefore, we cannot profess what is not true. We cannot burn incense to Caesar. In any event, this legacy of the original Christian political experience colored everything after in Christian experience, at least in Western history. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, the church needed as a practical matter to fill the void left by the collapse of Roman political power. By the 1200s, so about the 1200s, the High Middle Ages, the papacy was the most powerful political office in the West. And this is a fact I only actually learned recently. In the 1200s, the revenues of the papal court were greater than the revenues of the courts of every king in Europe. So essentially, it was the most powerful political office in continental Europe. Nevertheless, the papacy never claimed the empire. The Pope never claimed to be the new emperor himself, because two there are by which the world is chiefly governed. There are two spheres, two separate spheres, and so the fact that the Pope found himself as the most powerful political person in Europe, nevertheless, he could never, by actual Christian doctrine, rule in his own name. There had to be another ruler. Separation is natural in Christianity. And as a result, Archbishop Chaput in his book describes the political regime that emerges in the West, the political regime that we inherit and which we enjoy, as one of limited government under God. I think this is a very good description of the uniqueness of our political experience. Because of the two-ness of Pope and monarch, or of priest and royal governor, it has become traditional for political rulers in the West to recognize the limits to their power. And those limits, in turn, create the contours of our freedom. And again, I think this freedom is actually a function of the creation of a frontier that limits political power, a frontier created by the sphere of the church, which limits where political power can go. Consider some examples. Churches are not taxed, nor are schools, universities, hospitals, or charities. All the things that grew up under the mantle of the church. This untaxed nonprofit sector was not, in the first instance, a result of a pragmatic decision by state powers about how to efficiently allocate welfare dollars. It's not actually a policy at all. It's actually a legacy of the Middle Ages, which recognized a zone of human life beyond state control, a limit to the state's jurisdiction. The sphere of the state was beyond the jurisdiction the sphere of the church was beyond the jurisdiction of the state. And so this is a legacy which continues to this day, hardly ever questioned. And in this regard, I think that we have to keep in mind that we often sort of bang on about freedom of conscience. But we have to realize that freedom of conscience, again, is nested in this notion of the libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church. Freedom of conscience is something that was deduced from this notion that there is a sphere of human sociality, a sphere of human connectedness and organization that has its own structure of authority. And it's because that exists that human conscience must be respected. I have my doubts about whether human conscience will ultimately be respected if we don't have a robust notion of something like the church. Other legacies of the Middle Ages, we have limitations of the savagery of warfare, most especially the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. No political ruler recognized such distinctions or limitations or protections before Christianity. Again, what a political ruler can demand his soldiers to do what his armies can do, was effectively unlimited before the church said, no, these are limits beyond which you cannot go. And similarly, the rights, privileges, and immunities of individual citizens are widely recognized, and these rights constitute, again, a limit to what political power may do. Consider just one little example of what kings before Christianity could routinely do. Kings in many areas of the world before Christianity that were not touched by Christianity routinely forced marriages to occur among the nobles. It was, in fact, the king's right to do this. If you're a nobleman, you have to marry her because it's convenient for me to have you marry her. And this is something that becomes unimaginable in Christianity again, because Christianity recognizes limits to what political power can do, and one of those limits is constituted by the free choice of persons in marriage. So again, things that we think are outrageous were considered outrageous by Christians, but this is very ancient achievements by Christianity. Now, America, as we say, is a free country, and we usually boast that we're unique, indeed exceptional in our devotion to freedom. But what is not enough recognized, I think, is that the spirit of liberty in America, the habit of liberty, and therefore the everyday expectation of liberty that we associate with our free country, are really the fruit of this fundamental limitation placed on political power by the church in the Christian centuries. It was the church that created the space for what we now call civil society. All those forms of voluntary association which we mostly take for granted, but which are actually strikingly absent in many regions of the earth. All those forms of voluntary association are, when all is said and done, the most important thing that we do with our freedom. When we get together as married people and form families, when we get together as the Knights of Columbus. In many parts of the earth, a political ruler would not allow there to be a thing like the Knights of Columbus. How dare you get together? Isn't that basically a conspiracy against the public order constituted by my political authority? That's the normal way politics goes. In normal politics, people getting together is a conspiracy against the political order of the established authority. In the normal course of human history, that's what happens. And really, the fact that we take a much more benign view of people coming together in bodies, assemblies, ecclesia means assembly, is because of the church. But if limited government under God was an inheritance that America received from England, even as we incorporated English common law here, there was at the same time a more theoretical understanding of what the Americans were doing in their revolution, an understanding that traded on Enlightenment characters of Christianity in general, but Catholicism in particular as bastions of backwardness and tyranny. Thus, negotiating the boundary separating church and state has always been a complex and controversial affair in the United States. From the beginning, there have been those, for example, who objected to mail delivery on Sundays, absence of mail delivery on Sundays. Why exactly does the U.S. government not deliver mail on Sundays? Aren't you respecting a particular Christian thing, the Sabbath? Why do we preference the Christians in this way? That objection was placed basically the first day that there was a post office in the United States. So the contours of where church and state divide have been controversial from the beginning. Nevertheless, I think that we can say by the early 20th century, America had achieved what we can call an accommodating separationism. Separation of church and state was accepted. However, there was ample concession that recognized the uniquely Christian character of the American people. This began to change in earnest in 1947 with the Supreme Court's decision in the case Everson versus the Board of Education of Ewing Township, New Jersey. This was a landmark decision which incorporated the First Amendment's no establishment clause against the states. And I have two comments on the Everson decision. One is, now we're switching to the American constitutional scene. One is that it's very hard to understand how you incorporate the no establishment clause of the First Amendment against the states. Because we know, as a matter of history, that the wording of the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, was worded the way it was precisely so that Congress could not disestablish churches in places like Massachusetts that had them. So in order to incorporate the provision of the First Amendment against the states is to void the meaning of the First Amendment, which was to limit federal power to either establish or disestablish churches at state level. So it's an intellectual monstrosity. It's also, I would say, that it's no accident that the Everson decision and the string of religion decisions that followed it over the next 40 years, really, concerned schooling. Because schools were the new thing that had emerged in American life, particularly public schools. And the problem with schooling is this. Schools are moralizing. That's what you do with the young. You provide them moral education. The problem is, whose morality do you teach? And this was implicit in schools from the beginning, and it was controversial. That's why the Catholics established a Catholic school system, because Catholics did not want their children being moralized along WASP or Protestant lines. I say this, by the way, as a Catholic convert from high WASPism. And believe me, it was true. I mean, believe me, the WASPs did not want Catholic morality or Catholic norms. So in any event, that's the problem. If you have schools, what's the morality you're going to teach? You can't bracket that off. You can't disestablish the morality. You've got to teach something. However, the Supreme Court said that we could, that we would be neutral. But the Supreme Court, frankly, got a little out of hand because it said that in addition to being neutral among particular religions, not respecting one particular religion, that we were going to be neutral in our schools between religion and irreligion. And I don't see, this seems to me to sort of violate the non-contradiction principle, that how you can actually be neutral between religion and irreligion, I don't get it. It seems to me either you have religion there or you don't have religion there, and one way or the other, you're actually favoring either religion or irreligion. Effectually, the public schools now are on the side of irreligion. Now, the progress of Supreme Court cases from 1947 until the 1980s led to the articulation of the view by Richard John Newhouse, a Lutheran convert priest in New York, the founder of the journal First Things, that we were encountering a naked public square. That what the courts had done over the preceding 40 years, circa the 1980s, was stripped Christianity from the public square. But that was 30 years ago when he wrote his book entitled The Naked Public Square. What's new today? Is there something new today? And I think that the answer to that is that yes, what's occurring now is we're seeing the clothing of the public square with a substantive morality of its own. Let's call it the paganization of the public square. And that this is really the project that we face today as Catholics and Christians. It's one thing to face the naked public square. You can fill it. You can try to fill it with your evangelical message. But when the public square becomes positively pagan, you're in a different place. So let me give you the two primary examples of this paganization. The first, of course, is same-sex marriage, in which polymorphous perversity will be celebrated publicly, and those who disagree will be persecuted. As Pete said, there's already no Catholic adoption in the state of Massachusetts. Similarly, Catholic charities in Illinois are effectively closed down in many areas, and all of this is only the beginning of what will come as this moves forward. With same-sex marriage, a lie is being put into law, and what is demanded of us is that we acquiesce in the lie. I'm reminded of dissident friends of mine in Eastern Europe who basically understood that totalitarianism is always the regime of the lie, and that the single most demeaning and degrading thing about living in communism was that you were constantly coerced, forced, cajoled into towing the line on the line, to say that what was false was true and what was true was false, to act, not only to acquiesce, but to actively participate in the lie. And it seems to me that by hook and by crook, same-sex marriage will be doing this here in the United States. Second, of course, is the Health and Human Services mandate under the Obamacare provision, in which church institutions themselves, and Catholics in general, will be coerced into participating materially in crimes. So we will be materially cooperating in evil under this new law. We will be forced to pay for sterilization, contraception, including contraceptions that cause abortion. And if we do not, we will be an owner of a business will be fined $2,000 per employee, which, if you're Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame, for example, comes to, I think it's $10 million a year. It was calculated, so a $10 million a year fine against the University of Notre Dame. What's the point of this? What is the point of the Health and Human Services mandate? It seems to me that the point is to eliminate the space for there to be dissent, to eliminate the space for anyone to hold an opposite view. Just as towards the end of the Third Reich, it was required for everyone to be a member of the Hitler Youth. Between certain ages, there were no exemptions left. Everyone was forced to participate. And so in this case, we will be forced to participate in the lie. Our own dollars will be complicit in the lie that fertility is a disease. Because that's what's at the heart of the HHS mandate, is that now publicly in the United States, we all recognize and we are all on the same page with the idea that fertility is a disease. Now, I've already gone on too long. So I'm going to stop right there and turn it over to Katie.